Good afternoon. Today I can announce the next step in the economic fight against the coronavirus pandemic with new support for the self-employed. Our step-by-step action plan is aiming to slow the spread of coronavirus so fewer people need hospital treatment at any one time, protecting the NHS's ability to cope. At every point, we have followed expert advice to be controlled in our actions, taking the right measures at the right time. We are taking unprecedented action to increase NHS capacity by increasing the number of beds, key staff and life-saving equipment on the front line to give people the care they need. That is why it is absolutely critical that people follow our instructions to stay at home so that we can protect the NHS and save lives. Our action plan to beat this pandemic is the right thing to do, but we know that people are worrying about their jobs and their incomes. Working closely with businesses and trade unions, we have put together a coherent, coordinated and comprehensive economic plan, a plan which is already starting to make a difference. Big employers like Brewdog, Timpsons and Pret have already said that our coronavirus jobs retention scheme means they will protect thousands of jobs. And we are publishing this evening detailed guidance on how the scheme will operate so that other businesses can protect jobs too. Small businesses are already benefiting from the coronavirus business interruption loans of up to £5 million, which are interest-free for 12 months, with 30,000 inquiries in just 4 days. Local authorities are already informing over 700,000 retail, hospitality and leisure businesses that they will pay no business rates this year. And the new hardship grant scheme, providing cash grants of up to £25,000 for the smallest businesses, is now up and running. So if any business is struggling and worrying they may need to lose staff, I would urge you to log on to businesssupport.gov.uk and look very carefully at what support is available before deciding to lay people off. I'm proud of what we've done so far, but I know that many self-employed people are deeply anxious about the support available for them. Musicians and sound engineers, plumbers and electricians, taxi drivers and driving instructors, hairdressers and childminders, and many others, through no fault of their own, risk losing their livelihoods. To you, I say this: you have not been forgotten. We will not let you behind. We all stand together. So to support those who work for themselves, today I'm announcing a new self-employed income support scheme. The government will pay self-employed people who have been adversely affected by the coronavirus a taxable grant worth 80% of their average monthly profits over the last 3 years, up to £2,500 a month. This scheme will be open to people across the UK for at least 3 months, and I will extend it for longer if necessary. You'll be able to claim these grants and continue to do business. And we're covering the same amount of income for a self-employed person as we are for furloughed employees, who also receive a grant worth 80%. That's unlike almost any other country and makes our scheme one of the most generous in the world. Providing such unprecedented support for self-employed people has been difficult to do in practice, and the self-employed are a diverse population, with some people earning significant profits. So I've taken steps to make this scheme deliverable and fair. To make sure that the scheme provides targeted support for those most in need, it will be open to anyone with trading profits of up to £50,000. To make sure only the genuinely self-employed benefit, it will be available to people who make the majority of their income from self-employment. And to minimise fraud, only those who are already in self-employment, who have a tax return for 2019, will be able to apply. 95% of people who are majority self-employed will benefit from this scheme. HMRC are working on this urgently and expect people to be able to access the scheme no later than the beginning of June. If you're eligible, HMRC will contact you directly, ask you to fill out a simple online form, then pay the grant straight into your bank account. And to make sure no one who needs it misses out on support, we have decided to allow anyone who missed the filing deadline in January, 4 weeks from today, to submit their tax return. But I know many self-employed people are struggling right now, so we've made sure that support is available. Self-employed people can access the business interruption loans. Self-assessment income tax payments that were due in July can be deferred to the end of January next year. And we've also changed the welfare system so that self-employed people can now access universal credit in full. A self-employed person with a non-working partner and 2 children living in the social rented sector can receive welfare support of up to £1,800 a month. The scheme I've announced today is fair. It is targeted at those who need it the most, and crucially, it is deliverable, and it provides an unprecedented level of support for self-employed people. As we've developed the scheme, I'm grateful for the conversations I've had with the Federation of Small Businesses, the Association of Independent Professionals and the Self-Employed, and a range of trade unions, including the Trades Union Congress. But I must be honest and point out that in devising this scheme, in response to many calls for support, it is now much harder to justify the inconsistent contributions between people of different employment statuses. If we all want to benefit equally from state support, we must all pay in equally in future. These last 10 days have shaken our country and economy as never before. In the last 2 weeks, we have put aside ideology and orthodoxy to mobilise the full power and resources of the British state. We have done so in the pursuit of a single goal: to protect people's health and economic security, by supporting public services like the NHS, backing businesses, and protecting people's jobs and incomes. What we have done will, I believe, stand as one of the most significant economic interventions at any point in the history of the British state and by any government anywhere in the world. We have pledged that whatever the resources the NHS needs, it will get. Promised to pay 80% of the wages of furloughed workers for 3 months up to £2,500. Deferred more than £30 billion of tax payments until the end of the year. Agreed nearly 17,000 time-to-pay arrangements for businesses and individuals. Made available £333 billion of loans and guarantees. Introduced cash grants of up to £25,000 for small business properties. Covered the cost of statutory sick pay for small and medium-sized businesses for up to 2 weeks per employee. Lifted the incomes of over 4 million households with a nearly £7 billion boost to our welfare system. Agreed a 3-month mortgage holiday with lenders and nearly £1 billion more support for renters through the local housing allowance. And today, we've announced one of the most generous self-employed support schemes anywhere in the world. Despite these extraordinary steps, there will be challenging times ahead. We will not be able to protect every single job or save every single business. But I am confident that the measures we have put in place will support millions of families, businesses, and self-employed people to get through this, get through it together, and emerge on the other side both stronger and more united. Thank you. I think if we can take some questions from the media, turning first to Laura Koonsberg from the BBC.
Thank you very much, Chancellor. You've said you hope to cover nearly all of the self-employed, but what about people who this scheme does not cover? And when do you hope the money will start coming through? And if I may, we've been really inundated with worries from people who feel they're not safe at work. We had a message from someone saying their employer was forcing people. They said, everyone knows it's wrong, but we are being emotionally blackmailed by bosses saying if we don't come to work, people will lose their jobs. As the Chancellor, what do you say to employers who are flouting the rules like that? And to the Deputy CMO, if I may, when do you now expect the peak of the virus to be from the most up-to-date information you have, please?
Thanks, Laura. To your first question, this scheme, if you look at people who make the majority of their earnings from self-employment, this scheme will cover 95% of them. Of the people that it does not cover, that last 5%, those above the income threshold that we set, their average incomes are about £200,000. So we think what we have done is reasonable, proportionate and fair, and as I said, covers 95% of all self-employed people who make the majority of their earnings from self-employment. So I think it is a very generous scheme in that regard, and treats them with the same parity that we did for employed. In terms of the timing, our expectation is that this will be up and running by the beginning of June. We will look to try and do it faster than that, but I don't want to promise something that we can't deliver today. As I've said before, this is operationally complicated. We are already designing brand new schemes to cover the 90% of the population that are employed. Here, we need to design another scheme on top of that, and we also want to give now 4 weeks for people who haven't filed their tax return yet from January an opportunity to do so to benefit from this scheme. And I think that was a trade-off that was worth making, giving people that little bit of extra time now, those late filers, but that does have a little bit of a knock-on impact about when the scheme can be fully up and running. And I'll turn to Jenny to answer your second question around workplace guidance and the virus timing.
So I think on the workplace guidance, it's really important that employers, most of whom have been extraordinarily supportive, I think, of their employees, stick to the normal principles of workplace health. We've made it very clear, I think, what those principles are. If people can work from home, they should be able to. If they can't, there may be adaptations that they can do in the workplace. And we've also made it clear what sorts of distances and practical measures can be made to ensure people are safe. So in some ways, although we're being more specific about the public health requirements in the middle of this outbreak, actually the same principles about workplace safety apply. And I know the Health and Safety Executive were reminding workplaces of that today earlier. On the issue of the peak in the epidemic, I'm sure you will not be surprised to know that I am not going to predict a precise timing for that. And the reason for that is we are only just starting to see a bite, if you like, in the interventions, the social distancing that have been put into place. It would be far too early to predict that. I think we are starting to see some helpful movement, let's put it that way, and what we will be looking for is a change in the slope rather than being a very steep curve upwards. We will be looking for it to be a gentler slope, but we must not take our foot off the pedal. People have been really cooperative, and I think in the last few days the public have really understood that this is something very serious, and their actions, wherever they are, will save lives. So too early to say yet, but I think starting to move in the right direction.
Great. Thank you. Can we turn next to Beth Rigby from Sky?
Thank you, Chancellor. A question for you on your scheme. A big scheme, but you can't get the money until June. You're telling people that they can apply for universal credit, but there's a 5-week wait for the first payment. Can you guarantee to people watching this who are in immediate and desperate need that if they apply for universal credit, that they will get an advance payment in 10 days or less to tide them over? And a question, if I may, to the Deputy CMO, how many NHS staff are currently unable to work because they are unwell or self-isolating? It's obviously an area of huge concern for everyone. Thank you.
Beth, to your question about people's immediate cash flow needs, to which of course we're enormously sympathetic to, we've done a couple of things with regard to universal credit. First, making it just more accessible, particularly for those who are self-employed, and more generous in that regard overall, in terms of the measures I've already announced. But in terms of speed, it is already the case, and the Department for Work and Pensions are highly focused on this, that people can get an advance payment almost immediately after the claim, so they do not have to wait for the 5 weeks. An advance payment can be given almost immediately, certainly within days. That's very much what they are already doing. On top of that, we have deployed extra resources into local authorities, particularly to help those who are most vulnerable with things like their council tax bill, which for many families is a very large bill that they face every month. And so local authorities now are in receipt of the extra money we've given them, and they can work in their own communities to identify those most vulnerable families that you've talked about and ensure they get a little bit of extra help to help tide through the difficult few weeks and months ahead.
Thank you. So I don't have the precise figure with me this afternoon in relation to NHS staffing, but I'm sure my NHS colleagues would do. I think the important thing is I do recognise that there are a significant number of staff who are absolutely doing the right thing, as the rest of the public are, in taking themselves out of the workforce if they are symptomatic, and maintaining the safety for the rest of the public, but particularly the vulnerable patients. And I think we have to recognise and support that. The two things we have been doing to try and improve that as we go forward, that is the right thing to do, but we can help everybody, I think. Number one, to be clear on what the workplace guidance is. And there is some very helpful guidance through the NHS, but particularly for people with in the vulnerable group, if you like, with underlying conditions. I think some people have interpreted that if they're healthy and well but have an underlying condition as perhaps needing to stay right out of the workforce. But for some of those people, it will be appropriate for them to work, but on an individual discussion with their workplace. And then I think the other issue, obviously, is I know you'll be aware we are trying to push forward on our testing programme, but right at the top of that list are the healthcare workers and our care workers more generally, and the frontline responders, for example, in police and other first-line response systems. And that's because we recognise that knowing whether people have had the disease or not brings people back into the workplace now, but it also means we know what our resilience is going forward as we move into the depths, really, of the epidemic. So it's for all of us to do that, and that's what we're trying to do.
Thank you. Can I turn next to Robert Peston from ITV?
Hello?
Afternoon, Robert.
Oh, hello. Sorry, my connection doesn't seem to be terribly stable, so I'll give it a go. So what about the many people who've only recently entered the workforce, might not have 3 years of accounts and not even 1 year of accounts? How can they get help? Secondly, how long do you expect this scheme to run for? Do you have an estimated cost per month of the scheme? And finally, did I hear you right that when we're through this, you intend to equalise tax and national insurance between employment and self-employment, essentially as a sort of form of natural justice, since they're all being bailed out, all of us are being bailed out on the same basis? And then finally, for the Deputy CMO, Chris Whitty said yesterday that the big problem in terms of ramping up testing is a world shortage of the bits and the kits. Why didn't we order the kits weeks ago when this first emerged as a problem? Why did we wait till everybody else had ordered kits?
Robert, what was your first question exactly? It cut out for a second.
Oh, sorry. So the first question is, significant numbers of people have only entered the self-employment workforce recently.
And
they
won't
have
3 years.
accounts. They certainly won't have 3 year accounts. They won't even have 1 year of accounts. How are you going to help them?
Yeah. So what we will do is, for those that don't have 3 years, we will look at whatever they do have, whether it's 1, 2 or 3. But seeing as we're looking at trading profits or partnership profits, obviously those can be volatile year to year. So where people do have more than 1 year, we will look to average out over the years. That was something that many people called for because it seems a sensible thing to do to smooth out that volatility. If people only have 1 year, we will be forced to only look at the 1 year. For people who we don't know anything about, there is really nothing we can do, and that's one of the complicated things we've been wrestling with. I think most people accept that we have to use the database of people we know about and that have filed tax returns. That's the population that we have that I talked to, those that filed tax returns in January 31st of this year, or the late filers, which we'll give 4 weeks to. For those who are very recently self-employed, we cannot operate a scheme like this. There is just too much complexity, both operationally and fraud risk with that. So we would have to say to those people, please look at the extra support we've put into the welfare system to help you at this time. But as I said, this covers the vast majority of people. In terms of the time frame for the scheme, what we've said is analogous to the employed scheme. We would do this for 3 months. So obviously, if we are able to make payments to people at the beginning of June, they would receive 3 months payments at that one time, backdated to March, completely comparable to the employed scheme. And with regard to your question on tax, I think the broader point I would make is, rather than be too specific right now about future tax policy, is just an observation that there is currently an inconsistency in contributions between self-employed and employed, and obviously the actions taken today, which is very significant tens of billions of pounds of support for those who are self-employed, treating them the same way as those who are employed, it does just throw into light that question of inconsistency and whether that is fair to everybody going forward, especially as we look when we get through this and we're all chipping in together to right the ship afterwards, making sure that everyone is doing their bit as well. And I think that's a very fair and reasonable observation to make at this time. I'll hand over to Jenny for your other question.
So, thank you, Robert. In relation to testing, so I think with all of these things, whether it be testing or PPE, we have ordered and we have planned ahead. But I think what the public perhaps will recognise is that this is a brand new event. It's a pandemic, and every single country is ordering at the same time. And many of the reagents and the items that are used are coming from some single suppliers, but many from international suppliers, many of whom have actually been affected themselves by the pandemic. So I think this is not an issue of a lack of forethought in planning. It is an unprecedented event. And I think a few other points which are worthwhile thinking about. It is a brand new virus, so even to understand how you might test it, you need to have the virus and understand a little bit about it before you can start. And there is also a point which is really important. Whilst we're dealing with coronavirus, so colleagues in Public Health England, for example, on a day-to-day basis, still need to manage all the other individual infections which are in the country, and some of those will be of higher significance, a higher risk for individual people. So it'd be wrong for us to be moving, for example, stock from our daily work into this. I mean, on a final point, and I think Chief Medical Officer made the point yesterday, the evaluation of this is absolutely critical. So we do have evaluations running now, and I recognise we all want to see these testing programmes very active, but it is vitally important that when we have a test, we know it does what we want it to do, not that we have incorrect information.
Brilliant. Thank you. Can we turn next to Jason Groves from the Daily Mail?
Thanks, Councillor. Can I ask, you said I think that this scheme will come into force in June. What self-employed people are supposed to live on until then? I can also pick up Robert's point on the future tax treatment. Without getting into too much detail, which you obviously can't do at this stage, is it fair to say that you are warning the self-employed that they may well have to pay more tax in the future? And a question for Jenny Harris. Can I ask there's millions of us now cooped up in our houses. Are you at all worried about the kind of health impacts of that? We've seen kind of supermarket booze aisles stripped bare. Are you worried about the impact of mental health problems, obesity, drink problems in this crisis?
Jason, to your first question on timing, I refer to what I said previously. We've looked very hard at the quickest possible way to deliver this. We are already delivering a brand new system to deal with the employment scheme that we've set up, which covers 90% of the population. That will be up and running by the end of April to ensure that those businesses can meet their payroll in April and use that scheme to pay their furloughed workers. It is ultimately the same group of people, the same systems that need to do this. So we can do some of it in parallel, but some of it will have to be in sequence and come afterwards. Also, because we've taken the decision to allow people who are late in filing their tax returns in January, 4 weeks from today, the opportunity to file their tax returns and benefit from this scheme, that also will have some impact on timing, which again I think is a reasonable and sensible trade-off to make in the circumstances. They will get 3 months in one go in June, which obviously will be welcome. And as I said, we have made available multiple other avenues of support in the interim for this population of people. Very considerable investments, both in the welfare system, through local councils, and other tax deferrals. And with regard to the thing, again, I'm not anticipating future policy. I'm just making the observation that I think it is harder to sustain the argument that if you're employed and paying a higher rate of tax on the basis that you are treated differently, and now we're treating everybody the same and at a very, very significant cost, that we as a country and as a society, as we get through this, and all together are figuring out, once we get through this, how we then right the ship afterwards. This is an observation that I think is eminently fair to make now at this point, and then we can discuss in the future, how best we all come together to get through this, and as I said, to right the ship and make sure that we get everything back on track again. Jenny?
Thank you. So yes, I personally and many of my public health colleagues have made it very clear that we recognise that there are potential mental health risks as well, that we need to be looking after our bodies and our minds at the same time. That particularly applies to our very high risk vulnerable group who we have asked to almost take themselves out of society for 12 weeks. That's a really big ask. And it's why in the letters which have gone out to them, there are specific links and suggestions around mental health and mental health welfare, linking with Every Mind Matters, all sorts of links to do that. But I might actually put a more optimistic view as well, which is if people are not going out to work, and often that actually creates quite a stress in terms of travel time, they have more free time to themselves, and it might be the best opportunity the whole country has to say, I'm going to use my one exercise session every day to ensure that by the time this is over, I am super fit and so is my family. And in fact, if you have something restricted, it suddenly becomes quite a pleasurable event. So even though you may not have wished to jog along the street before, doing so now might actually be quite a relief and quite a positive thing for us all to do.
Brilliant, thank you. George Parker from the FT.
Thank you, Chancellor. You've made no secret at all of the fact that the scheme has been very difficult to design. Would you accept that it's open to abuse? For example, people claiming the money and then basically sitting at home. And what would you say to people thinking of potentially abusing the system? The second one, a number of medium-sized companies have been in touch with us to say that the Bank of England loan scheme isn't working for them because they don't have an investment grade. What can you do to help those companies in this so-called squeezed middle? And a quick question to the Deputy CMO. I don't think we've ever really had a public explanation of why this country decided to stop testing people who are suffering with symptoms of coronavirus when certainly the World Health Organization is advocating that as a policy, and many other Asian countries have done this with great success.
George, thank you. On your first question first about the scheme, look, we are designing these things at pace, as you rightly identified. Given the circumstances, I don't think we should let the perfect be the enemy of the good. We accept that has some challenges. That's why we've put some of the conditionality into the scheme to limit some of the risks that you identified. For example, making this for people who have an actual tax return that we can look at, so we know that there are real people who are genuinely self-employed and not just telling us out of the blue that they are. That's kind of very obvious check. There will be a form that people will have to fill in. We will contact them, because we can identify them ourselves, who we think should be eligible. We will ask them to apply and check a few other boxes just to confirm, to your point, that they are still trading and some other things, which we can then later verify as well. So we will be able to actually put in place some sensible compliance measures in that regard. To your second point, and that's a very excellent point. Now, we've obviously put in place a bunch of different loan guarantee schemes to provide credit to corporate UK. There was an issue with the commercial paper facility that we had originally set up with the Bank of England, and it was for people who had an investment grade rating. There are perfectly good private companies that are creditworthy but don't have that rating. What we have done is work with the Bank of England to find a workaround for that, so that we can impute a credit rating from the company's individual relationships with their banks, and in that way construct a rating. We think that will significantly increase the addressable number of companies that can now benefit from that scheme. The details of that are imminently about to be published, and I thank the Bank of England for working with us constructively on that. And what it will mean is that between the Coronavirus Business Interruption Loan Scheme at the bottom end for companies up to £45 million of turnover and the commercial paper facility on the top end, we will now be covering 80% of UK employment and 80% of corporate UK turnover with those two schemes. That still does leave a small 20% gap in the middle. We are finding ways to try and address that gap as well. Obviously that's a little bit more challenging because by definition those companies are not as creditworthy, and this is taxpayer money we're putting on the line, so we need to make sure that there is some way that we are protected in that regard. But I think now that we have an improved commercial paper scheme, we've got 80% of employees and corporate revenue covered, and there's a small gap that we are actively working on to find some creative solutions for.
Thank you, Rishi. So I think I'm going to answer in two different sections. So the first one about the WHO comment. So I think the comment you were picking up was Dr. Tedros saying test, test, test. But in fact, we need to realise that the clue for WHO is in its title. It's a World Health Organisation, and it is addressing all countries across the world with entirely different health infrastructures, and particularly public health infrastructures. We have an extremely well-developed public health system in this country, and in fact our public health teams actually train and others abroad. We have supported WHO through their Go-On process, and some of our epidemiologists have gone out to Manila, for example, to support the early response in that area. So the point there is that they are addressing every country, including low and middle income countries. So encouraging all countries to test of some type. When you come to the UK, we have made it very, very clear there has been a plan right the way through this, which is entirely consistent with the science and epidemiology. We started with a containment phase, and every early case of this disease was followed through. Every contact was traced exactly as we would do for other diseases, but particularly noticing this one. And of course, the viewers will be very familiar with the fact that we had some very strict and very successful containment facilities. But there comes a point in a pandemic where that is not an appropriate intervention, and that is the point really where we moved into delay. And although we still do some contact tracing and testing, for example in high-risk areas like prisons or care homes, that is not an appropriate mechanism as we go forward. At that point, what we need to do is focus on the clinical management of the patients first and foremost, and then additionally, as I've said earlier, on our health and care staff and first responder staff. So obviously, if there was infinite testing facilities, and we are growing them at pace and we will have them, then it moves to the public. But we need to be very careful about focusing where it's clinically most valuable.
Thank you. And to Anna Mikulova from The Telegraph. Anna, sorry, we can't hear you.
Hello, does that work?
Yes, we can now.
Right. Chancellor, when you look at the US unemployment figures from today and the number of people claiming universal credit here, does it make you concerned that the cure could be worse than the virus? And secondly, the Deputy CMO has previously suggested the lockdown could continue on and off for 6 months. Are you concerned that the economy could be destroyed by then? And a quick question for the Deputy CMO. Public Health England said 1 million members of the public are going to be sent self-testing kits at home. Who will these people be? How will you choose them? And what will happen to their test results?
And obviously, I have seen the numbers both from the US and indeed here, and of course they're very worrying. these are people's livelihoods, their jobs, their financial security, which is now being severely damaged. I'm very cognizant of that. That's why we have acted, I think, at incredible speed to put together a number of different packages of support to protect people's jobs and incomes and provide them with financial security through what is going to be a very challenging few weeks and months. There's no two ways about that. But we are taking the advice from our medical and scientific advisors. It is the right strategy where we make the right decisions at the right time to protect people's lives, but also control the spread of this virus to a level where we can cope with it, which then allows us from a position of strength to decide how best to manage things from that point forward. But I absolutely acknowledge this is going to be challenging. People's lives and economic livelihoods are going to be impacted, but I do believe the measures of support that we've put in place will make an enormous difference to helping to alleviate some of that hardship. And I think to your, I think Jenny, do you want to, yeah.
And I was going to pick up, I think the point about lockdown was it potentially is taken out of the context in the sense that what I was saying was we may see measures of lockdown going forward over the next 6 months. That would not be an implausible outcome, but I also said, I think, that as we're watching the curve, it may be possible, definitely not now because we're only just starting to get some benefit from this, but it may be possible to start moving that. So the issue here is about, exactly as we have done all the way through with this, is about watching the epidemiology and flexing those interventions at the right time, in the right place, to deliver what we need. And obviously, I think the whole country, and myself included, will want to be back to normal as soon as we can. So I think mentioning a 6 month, it's to give a general look forward about the sorts of length of this type of pandemic. But we have to remember also that we have, if we are successful, we are lessening the spike on the curve and we are pushing it forward. So success in some ways means pushing it forward, but not necessarily with the strengthened interventions that we have at the moment all the way through. So that would be the first point. I don't precisely recognise the quote that you were talking about in relation to Public Health England, but I think there are 2 points probably. One is we will want to understand very quickly the way the disease has travelled around the country and through different elements of our population. So it may be that quote was in relation to work which will almost certainly go forward in due course, understanding with a proportionate sample of the population who has had the disease and who has not, and that will give us a strong clue as to when we know when the outbreak may end completely. So it's about understanding through different age groups and different vulnerable groups what has happened, which you cannot do consistently for absolutely everybody, a whole population in the middle of an outbreak. But I think in relation to other testing and who gets it and who doesn't, I think I've probably answered that with the earlier one. The absolute point here is it is clinical benefit. It is the people who are going into hospital, into our intensive care units with acute respiratory distress syndrome and pneumonia, the same into the wards, and then those high-risk areas, and then onto our healthcare workers.
Thank you. Thank you. We're out of time. So just in conclusion, if I could say, today was about providing reassurance to the millions of people who are self-employed and are anxious about their security and their livelihoods. I think by any international standard, the package that we have outlined today represents one of the most generous and comprehensive ways to support those in self-employment anywhere in the world. And I would conclude by saying this to all of those who are self-employed, who are rightly anxious and worried about the next few months. You haven't been forgotten. We will not leave you behind, and we are all in this together. Thank you.